Now, once again, we welcome Dr. David Ryden, who joined Hope College Political Science faculty in 1994. He's published numerous books and articles on the Supreme Court, the electoral process, religious liberty, and other topics at the intersection of religion and politics. He has a BA from Concordia College, a law degree from the University of Minnesota, and a PhD from the Catholic University of America. And I have to remember to hold this up too. Dr. Ryden.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you all for coming back, and for those online, welcome. I kind of forget you're there. The alert about for those who are on Zoom or on camera just makes me think, I think I may be here next week to do some discussion of the Supreme Court and constitutionalism. And when we were in that very bizarre sort of pandemic inflicted world of living on screens, that included the Supreme Court, who took their oral arguments onto Zoom, and it produced some interesting moments among justices who sort of forgot that there was not only pictures, but there was sound. One of the famous moments was the flushing of a toilet in the midst of an oral argument. Speculation had it, sort of the consensus was it was probably Justice Stephen Breyer, although we're not altogether sure. So thank goodness those times are past, although I really appreciate the availability of Zoom and for more people being able to join us for this conversation. If you have the outline, I'm just going to sort of keep working off the outline from last week as I look at it. We did okay, although I've got to be a little, I can't go down quite as many rabbit holes if I want to get to some of the things I want us to get to, which is last week, I think it was a little more conceptual. I want us to be able to talk a little bit today about some of the kind of the third-party history and some third-party movements that were consequential, and then to strategize and to think a little bit about the current moment and looking forward and what might be some approaches third-party movements might pursue to actually make a difference. So that's the goal. Thank you to those who filled out note cards. I took a bunch of those home, and I actually, if time permits, I've got my list of questions, and that is not to say you ought not to raise your hands, raise questions as we go, per usual. Always happy to entertain those. So let me take 1 minute to kind of summarize what we covered last week, which will kind of set the table for what I hope we can accomplish today. So maybe half a dozen talking points from last week. Talking point number one was the importance of parties to American democratic politics, small d, representative democratic politics. As Schatzsnyder said, democracy is impossible save political parties, okay? Parties are essential. Working democracy requires working political parties, number one. Point number two, our party system is broken, and it has been for a while, okay? Number three, I say that because the main critique I have of our major political parties and the two-party system is that they are broken and that they are essentially failing to carry out their central purpose, which is to represent we the people. Okay, and so I suggested last time that a working two-party system in America, which I thought for much or most of our history has worked pretty well. The two-party system does a good job of encompassing, responding to, and representing the wide swath of interests that make up this incredibly diverse country. And the modern era, kind of going back to the mid-90s, I argue our parties are increasingly failing to do that and failing to carry out that core function of representing we the people. All right. Point number 3 or 4, whatever we're on. People sense that brokenness in the party system. And so people are open to additional choices. People are open to third parties, independent candidacies, alternatives besides the R's and the D's. And yet, point 5, there is a disconnect between that openness and that desire for some additional choices and alternatives, and the role of third parties in American politics really going back to the early 90s, i.e. the sense that people have of the brokenness does not translate into significant third-party movements in America for some reasons we can talk about. And so point 6, my goal today is, as we think about third parties and how they might elevate their role and their presence in American politics, my ultimate goal is for them to serve the purpose of reforming and improving the two major parties, and to make those parties adapt, respond in ways that make them more representative, and to do a better job of representing the rich diversity of peoples and interests and policy preferences and values and all those sorts of things that make this such an incredible country. And if third parties win some elections along the way, all the better. All the better. I'm happy, right? So that's kind of where I'm coming from. That's, I think, what we covered last week. Kind of looking to that outline, we'd gotten through 1, 2, 3. Someone had asked, I forget, someone had asked a question about the why, right? And let me start here, and then we'll move into like 4 and 5. We can talk about why, the obstacles that third parties kind of face. And then we can do a very sort of quick sort of Cliff Notes historical look at significant third-party movements in America. But I went home and I thought a little, I tried to give some sort of a reasonable answer to this very complicated question. Like, why? Why are we so polarized? Why are the major parties, why did they seem so ill-suited to adapt to changes in the array of interests in our country? Because that's my, right? Ultimately, the problem with the major parties, I describe them as being sort of ossified and rigid. And so they tend to respond on each side to certain interests in their coalition, and they are so ossified they don't really adapt and have a flexibility that responds to changes in the electorate that make them more responsive. And I actually, like, if you want evidence of this, look at the headlines today, right? What's the story of the day? The shutdown, right? That is a stark lesson in the brokenness of the two major parties, right? And simply not being able to do governance, right? They can't even keep the doors of the darn federal government open, right? Why? Why? I would argue you can look at the leaders on each side, and they are not acting in the interests of broad coalitions on each side. Right. So on the Republican side, right, you have the party I described as the party of the president, right? It's really become sort of a personal vanity project for the president. He essentially was a third party candidate who took over one of the two main parties and has made it his own, right? And let me tell you, he is itching for a fight. He is itching for a budget fight. He is happy to have this shutdown. If you think Doge in the early days were just sort of bulls in the china shop and cutting and slashing, you ain't seen nothing yet. Okay. Let me tell you, there are many Republicans in Congress, in the Senate, who want reasonable sort of budget politics, keep government open. But, right, they are at the beck and call of he who works in the Oval Office. That's on the Republican side. Okay. On the Democratic side, the party of government, after all, right? Who's leading the way? Chuck Schumer. I don't get the politics behind on the Democratic side to sort of welcome this government shutdown, because I think in their honest moments, you give them some truth serum, they know what Trump is going to do with a government shutdown. It's going to be an excuse to send people packing and to not bring them back, to shrink government, to shrink the bureaucracy. That's not Democrats don't live for that. Right? So why are they doing what they are doing? Pure and simple, it is the progressive wing of the Democratic Party that likewise is itching for a fight, right? And they are itching to oppose the president, to oppose the Republicans at every turn. Okay. And so when you look at the parties responsive to narrower interests on their side, right? That's not Chuck Schumer. Chuck Schumer, right, the ranking Democrat in the Senate, has always been a deal maker. He finds a way to get things done. Chuck Schumer is scared to death of one thing and one person. Who might it be? AOC, right? AOC and a senatorial primary challenge in 2028. So you have the leader of the Democrats in the Senate basically operating in his own personal political interests in responding to ward off the kind of the more left-leaning progressive wing of his parties, and he's leading them over a cliff. And talk about cutting off your nose to spite your face, right? This is a lesson in broken parties, parties that are not responding to broad coalitions within each side, and as a result are failing to represent the American people. Okay, that may be harsh for you R's and D's in the room. You may want to argue. That's fine. We can argue when we have a time for some questions. Okay, but I think it's a good example. But back to that question. So why? Why are they so ossified? Why are they so polarized? Right? We now have these parties in Congress where there is no overlap in the middle between Republicans, right? You all, right, remember well enough several decades ago where you would have conservative Democrats in the House, in the Senate, who were to the right of center left or even a little liberal Republicans in the House and Senate, right? That is gone. That's completely gone. Right. There is no center kind of basis for compromise, for bipartisan legislation to happen. Okay. How has that happened? How have we gotten this separation of the parties that then has basically made the Republican Party the party of the president? And if you don't line up behind him, right, he will make sure there's a MAGA challenger in the primary to go at you from sort of the MAGA worldview, right? Or on the Democratic side, if you are not going to fight and right oppose at every turn, you can expect a more progressive primary challenge from your left. How did this happen? How did we get here? And I don't even remember what I said. I felt afterwards I didn't really answer it well. It's a complicated answer to how we've gotten this stark divide. Here are a few thoughts, and this is just kind of scratching the surface, okay? And this morning, I kind of jotted these down. There is a political dynamic that we've had since 1994, so for 3 decades plus, that is characterized by political parity between the two parties. Right? For a long time, latter half of the 20th century, you had a dominant Democratic Party in Congress. Right? You had the presidency that for a string tended to be more Republican, right? But it was not this congressional parity. And we've had parity since 1994. And it's right, you can look at it in just the back and forth, the zig and zag of who's controlling Congress and who the majority party is. Okay, you have that. And then you have a politics that is utterly focused on the White House and on the president being able to wield presidential power to essentially take the massive bureaucracy and all that they do and all the benefits that they provide and to direct them in the interest of his party and their interests, right? So you have this parity, right? And this focus on presidential elections, and it has produced what I think is this myopia among the political parties where they cannot look beyond the next election. It's all short term. It's all short term. It's winning the next presidential election so you can get your guy in that, right? And you all sort of reap the benefits. And that has, yeah, ironically, that's made the parties less broad, less big tent, more focused on the immediate, right? Base elections rather than, pulling in independents and folks in the middle. Overlay that on sort of culturally, what's going on culturally and what some have called the big sort. Or I would just say it's like this big sort of cultural divide. And some people will say, well, yeah, the politicians are really separated. They're really polarized. They're really divided. But are we the people? And to one extent, I want to say no, and some of it's artificial. And yet there have been these developments culturally that really have separated us out. And so working class versus managerial class. Right? Working class, blue collar versus sort of the professional class. That is really real. And guess what? They don't understand each other. Okay. The educational divide, right? And this is happening in the parties. So we see the realignment of the two major parties. The Republican Party is no longer the party of Country Club and Main Street and the Chamber of Commerce, right? It's the party of blue collar, of the less educated, including minorities, right? So you have this divide over education. We have the rise of identity politics, which can really be unhealthy. And guess what? Now that identity politics is not right. We have tended to kind of look at the left. Well, now you have identity politics on the right as well, a different kind. And with that identity politics comes sort of tribal mindset, right? And that's hard. It's hard to come together. We can throw redistricting in there. We can throw social media in there and echo chambers. We can throw in a media itself that is binary, that is polarized, that is divided, right? All that and sort of parties to some extent reflect that in their polarized nature. Okay, does that make sense? And we could go a lot deeper, but that kind of, right? So has redistricting made us artificially polarized? Darn yeah, darn right. It sure as heck has. But boy, that's only one piece of a much larger, kind of more complex sorting out and dividing, okay, and polarizing. All right. And so that has really contributed to these parties that not only are they narrower in who they're responding to, but they are not adaptable. They don't respond to changes in the electorate. So kind of what the administration has done on immigration, for example, and some of those issues, certainly they're responding to, I mean, that's a 75-25 issue for the Republicans, okay? And yet the president made great strides in the last election among Hispanic voters, like really huge strides. The Hispanic voters are now, man, they are a toss-up group of voters, right? And yet you don't see the president in his rhetoric and his language, in the particulars of the policy, responding to that, okay? You look at the Democrats. And I would argue much of that has happened with working class, including Hispanic and Black male voters, right? Moving to much of that has been cultural, right? They look at the Democrats and kind of what they view as sort of a cultural extremism, okay? And I think that really hurt the Democratic Party in the last election. Do you see Democrats responding to that? It's amazing how they have doubled down on so many of these issues that, again, are 80 to 20% issues in the more sort of traditional or sort of commonsensical position, right? Parties that do not respond to changes that are going on in the electorate. All right. Okay, let me quickly talk. So on your outline, obstacles to breaking this two-party hold, the duopoly, the Republican Democratic duopoly on our politics. I could get really sort of political sciencey. Let me just kind of tick these off quickly, right? So there are any number of reasons so I talk about people want more party choices. They are really open to, desirous of independent challenges, third-party candidates, and yet there's this disconnect that doesn't seem to ever materialize, okay? Well, so there's kind of a sense of fatalism, I think. There also are any number of sort of structural barriers and legal barriers and mental and psychological barriers that sort of get in the way and really present significant challenges to meaningful third-party movements. Okay, so biggest reason is the rules and the laws, right? And who writes the laws, right? So the laws around elections, campaigns and elections, those laws happen at what level of government? Little state, right? And so every state has their election law. Okay, and guess what? Who writes those election laws? Democrats and Republicans, right? So do they write the laws to favor the Democrats and the Republicans? Of course they do, right? So there is a legal regime that is not friendly to third parties and to independents. So ballot access, right? You have one of the biggest obstacles, like if you want to run a national or a presidential third-party candidacy, you've got to throw all your resources, monetary, volunteer, and other, into just getting on the ballot. Right? And so they face significant ballot access challenges. Our first past the post kind of mode of winning elections. So a single member congressional district or a state legislative district, the electoral college, right? These are winner take all, first past the post kinds of contests. Okay, that works against third parties. Right? Because guess what? What happens? They even if they run against the Democrat and Republican, they get 20%. Ross Perot 92. What does he have to show for it in the government that follows? Right? Nothing. Right? Nothing. Okay. And so it's difficult for a third party to sort of build momentum to carry on from one election to the next because of those winner take all rules. Okay, that's really significant. Certainly redistricting is done, right? It's done by the majority party to perpetuate the majority of the majority party, or if it's divided government at the state level, it's incumbency protection, right? It's you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. It's Dems and Repubs making sure there's balance. That clearly works against third parties, okay? The don't waste my vote mentality. People like the idea. I said last time at the end of this session, I'm going to make you put your money where your mouth is. Many of you will hear my exhortation for you to do something for a third-party candidate, and you're going to immediately think, yeah, but that person's not going to win, and I don't want to waste my vote. Okay, keep that in mind I got to make sure I leave time for that question for you. The lack of kind of party infrastructure. And so to the extent we see third parties, where do we see them? At the national level, right? We see them in a presidential contest or maybe a gubernatorial contest, right? The major party structures and systems certainly are far weaker at the state and local level than they once were, but they're there, right? They're there. Third parties tend to have none of that kind of infrastructure to build bottom-up grassroots, right, from the local and state party level. Okay. Two other things when we think about, right? So several of you in your comments said, well, how about a good centrist third party to run from the middle? That's a wonderful idea in the abstract. But I could canvass however many people in this room and ask you what would motivate you if you were planning a third party challenge. I don't know what we have, 60, 70, 80 people. I probably get 40 different things that you would want to challenge, that you would want to build your party around. So there's this idea that, oh, all we need is this third party challenge. Guess what? Third party, they will be as diverse, as polarized, coming from all sorts of different angles as the two major parties are, right? We can't assume there's going to be a sort of a consensus among third party voters. And then the other thing is just like, what motivates people's participation in politics? And who are the motivated? It's the partisans, right? It's the partisans. So people love to say, I'd welcome a third-party challenge. But third parties, especially if they're from the middle, they tend not to move people. right? They tend not to get us excited. And you got those darn partisan Democrats and Republicans, and they're motivated, right? And so they dominate the process, right? What can we do to sort of motivate people to actually act on kind of a third party impulse or leaning that they might have? That's really hard. I would argue that takes a particular unicorn as a candidate and a set of issues to sort of accomplish that. Okay. Yeah. So those are some of the challenges or obstacles. Let me sort of quickly go down, and this, I'm not a historian. I have a pretty, I do teach political parties. I've done some writing on party systems. I have a pretty good sense of third parties in America. But this is sort of what I call the Cliff Notes version of history, right? And let me sort of tick off, and I'll just kind of quickly go through what have been some of the more influential, consequential, meaningful third-party movements in our country's history. Then I'll kind of stop, take a breath, and we can maybe take a pause for any follow-up you have. Especially, you folks are familiar with many of these movements that have happened in the last 30 or 40, and maybe even going back to the 60s, okay? So it's important to remember, like at the outset, the framers, they had an antipathy towards political parties. They thought parties were factious and contentious, and really would be the bane of good government in America. George Washington on down, these quotes about the bane of the parties and not wanting them to really be in the mix. And so parties are not a creation of the Constitution. Okay. And you can read the famous federal papers, Federalist 10, talking about the great threat to liberty in America. And it is faction. And it's all about faction. And they define faction, and it includes what we would think of as political parties. Okay. That's Madison, the father of the Constitution, in Federalist 10, writing about the danger of faction, i.e. political parties, among other things, among special interests, right? But parties were included in that, okay? So there was a general consensus among the framers and the larger than life figures of the time that we don't want political parties, okay? And that lasted about 2 years, right? Where the practical realities of governance and organization overtook their high-minded ivory tower ideas, right? And so very quickly, we get a party system that springs up. And very quickly, because of the constitutional arrangements for elections, right, it ends up being kind of a two-party system. Okay. And so I kind of break, and this is very crude, okay? This is a very crude sort of delineation of different historical kind of times in American party politics. And so the first kind of history, the first phase I would describe as a sort of instability, political instability and change. And that kind of goes from the outset really through the 1800s. Okay. And then we get into the 1900s, and we do have kind of significant third-party presence that doesn't take over the main parties, but they have a significant influence on the third parties. And that goes from kind of the turn of the century in the populist and the progressive parties through segregation, Jim Crow, and through the civil rights era. And then and that kind of goes really up to the Perot early 90s. And then I would look at Perot's candidacy in 92 as kind of a hinge or a pivot into what I call the modern era, which is major party parity and minor party, I don't want to say irrelevance, but boy, kind of minimal presence. Okay. And that's kind of been the story since 1992 in Ross Perot. Right. So taking that first era of sort of instability, and we see lots of kind of movement from the outset through the Civil War and even through the later part of the 1800s. right? So we initially get the Federalists. They're the elitist Washington Adams Party. We get the Jeffersonian, you can call them Democrats, you can call them Jeffersonian Republicans. That's sort of the rural, agrarian, small government, anti-Federalist party, okay? They later become the sort of Jacksonian Democrats and give us what is our Democratic Party today. So they've kind of been there from the outset, right? Fairly quickly, the elitist party, the Federalists, they kind of go the way of the dinosaur. Even within a couple decades, we enter this era in the 18 teens that was called the era of good feelings. And it was essentially one-party politics. All right. Then we get the Whigs that kind of rise up in the late teens, the 1820s. And so they sort of step in for the Federalists. And that's the two-party system, right? We move forward into the 1840s and the 1850s. And this is the roiling of westward expansion and slavery and abolitionist movements, right? In the 1840s and the 1850s, we have the Liberty Party, we have the know-nothings who are nativists, right? We have divisions within both of the parties, sectional divisions between North and South among the Democrats, North and South among the Whigs, right? So it's just this fracturing of the party system, right? Out of that, the Whigs, they sort of can't manage their factions and their internal divisions. They collapse, they implode. We get this new party, the Republicans, in the early 1850s, right? And then over time, right, by post-Civil War, it's sort of down to this two-party system of the Democrats and the Republicans, right? That's not the end of this roiling of politics. So in the latter part of the 1800s, we get the kind of the agrarian populist movement and the populist party. They kind of wed themselves to the Democrats, right? Then we sort of gradually move into the 1900s, where I would argue we get like pretty consequential third party movements. So 1912, who do we get? Teddy and the Bull Moose, right? The Bull Moose Party, because Teddy feels strong as a bull moose. And it's a good label because it's Teddy's party, right? So he's president 1901 to 1908. He could have run again. He chooses not to. He hands sort of the Republican, we know it's sort of going to be the Republican presidency in 1908 to his understudy, Taft, William Taft. Teddy ends up being sorely disappointed by Taft and his inability to move forward, to get kind of Roosevelt's progressive agenda, to get that into law. And so Teddy steps back into the ring in 1912, challenges Taft for the Republican nomination, totally dominates him to the extent that, right, primaries are now starting to kind of pop up in terms of American politics, but they don't have the same binding significance as we think about primary politics today, right? So Roosevelt, he drubs Taft in the primaries that they hold. He is clearly the popular choice, right? But the Republican Party poobahs, what do? They easily nominate Taft. Okay, and so he becomes the Republican nominee. Well, Teddy's not going to, right? Teddy's a bull moose. He's not going to take that sitting down. He jumps in as an independent, the Bull Moose or the Progressive Party, and he essentially splits the Republican vote, right? He gets, I should have checked the numbers, something like 27% of the vote. Taft gets something like 22 or 23, and Woodrow Wilson gets 40 some, and he's the president. Okay, so right, the Bull Moose, that's been the most significant, obviously, kind of third party movement in terms of electoral impact, right? Impacting electoral outcomes. So we have that. We have the Socialist Party in the 19 teens. And so Eugene Debs, and right, many of you are probably familiar with Eugene Debs. And right, I grew up in Minnesota. And so in Minnesota, we had a Minnesota governor, Harold Stassen. Does that name mean anything? Yeah, Harold Stassen. Like at one point, he made a serious run. Like he was governor of Minnesota. Then he thought he was presidential timber. Okay, and so he proceeded to run for the presidency, got nowhere, but felt the need to keep running for the presidency year after year after year after year. And Minnesota nice means we put up with someone who ends up being a ridiculous figure, right? People tend to think of Eugene Debs kind of in that way, but it's a mistake, right? Because he runs for the president, I think in 4 consecutive elections, he runs as the socialist candidate. Tops out at 6%, I think in 1912, which is not bad, but it's like not earth-shaking. But that's misleading. Because so as we think about possible lessons from some of these historical movements, right? I mentioned the lack of sort of grassroots infrastructure among parties. The socialists really had significant success at the local and the state level of politics. In the 19 teens, there were, I think, upwards of 100 mayors elected as socialists, including Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Schenectady, New York, like some actually significant places. There was something like 1,200 office holders nationwide who were socialists, most of them at the lower levels of politics. I think they won a couple House, I think there were a couple House members who won and held office as socialists, right? So a fairly significant party movement in the early parts of the 1900s. Then we sort of, I should mention Robert La Follette from Wisconsin, sort of the great progressive, right? He ran in, so you had Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moose / Progressive Party, but that was sort of an Eastern kind of businessy, more elite kind of progressivism. La Follette runs in 1924 Midwestern, and it's agrarian, and it's labor, it's working class, it's a different kind of progressivism, and it has real resonance. And there is this kind of strong progressive agricultural, right? And so Minnesota to this day, the Democratic Party is the DFL, the Democratic Farm Labor Party, right? So La Follette's kind of progressivism, he got 17% of the vote in 1924. He won Wisconsin, and then he kind of flared out. But I would argue that progressivism there are strains of it to this day, kind of in the Midwestern states. Then we jump forward to sort of the middle of the century, and now we're looking at sectional parties, meaning they're regional, and they're Southern, and they're segregationist, right? And they're motivated by an antipathy towards the civil rights energy that is now kind of taking over the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, for that matter, all right? So in 1948, Strom Thurmond, right, who we sort of know of as dying in office as a 100-year-old Republican, right? In the 1940s, 1948, he is the presidential choice of the Dixiecrats, Southern segregationists, right? Anti-civil rights, breaking off from the Democratic Party, right? The Democratic Party is kind of the more retrograde party on race, although they're changing, because we're into the New Deal. And so it's just a really fascinating swirling politics, right? But Strom Thurmond breaks off the Dixiecrats. He wins 4 states, so 39 electoral college votes in 1948. In 1968, we get George Wallace, right, in the American Independent Party. And he's a little bit of a mirror of Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrats. They are Southern. They're breaking off from the Democratic Party only now the electoral impact is different, because they're also drawing from votes away from Law and Order Richard Nixon, okay? In 1968, Wallace gets 13% of the vote nationwide. Okay. He wins 5 states in the South, 46 electoral college votes. So Strom Thurmond gets 39 and 48. Wallace gets 46 and 68. As we try to think about contemporary strategies, keep these two in mind, right? So they did not ultimately turn the tide, but in 48, right, who won by the skin of his teeth? And one of the great sort of comeback stories of all time, Harry S. Truman, right? People had him, he was sort of gone, and he managed just to pull it out by a sliver, right? Strom Thurmond came really close to doing him in, right? Because he was largely taking Democratic votes, the conservative Democratic segregationists from the South. Okay, he was very close to sort of tipping that one, right? Maybe, arguably, you could say Wallace did the same thing in 68, right? In the 68, the major party election, Nixon and Humphrey. How close was that one? No, really close. It was close, really close. Okay. And, I think surveys tend to show, right, Wallace was taking a lot of people who otherwise would have, by then, right, Nixon is running law and order, right? Some are claiming there's a bit of a dog whistle, kind of racial dog whistle behind his politics. Arguably, Wallace is taking votes out of the Nixon column, right? Comes very close, I think very close, maybe to tilting that one in Humphrey's direction. So keep those two examples in mind, right? Sectional, I'm not saying the segregationist piece, I'm talking about the sectional piece. The regional candidates who are strong in regions of a country can focus on a limited number of states to win and deprive maybe one or maybe both of the major party candidates of a majority in the electoral college. Okay, keep that one in mind. Okay, I think I mentioned last time, John Anderson, not particularly significant, other than he won my first presidential vote in 1980. 6% of the vote, right? A Republican, Illinois, I think, wasn't he? I think John Anderson was from Illinois. Kind of a number of sort of Republicans who thought Ronald Reagan was, right, kind of scary conservative, right? So then I described Perot 1992 as what I think is the last really important third-party candidacy, and that's it hinges or pivots or kind of throws us into a modern era of much less of a presence by the third-party candidates. So Perot, right, in 92, he gets 92%. He gets 19% of the popular vote. Somebody in one of your questions, there was more of a comment, was, well, how can you call Perot like a significant candidate in 1992, given that he dropped out of the race? And I will say, like, that's my point exactly. Meaning, in the summer of 1992, surveys had him leading, right? People found Bill Clinton and George Herbert Walker Bush uninspiring, pedestrian, right? They love this nasally, jug-eared Texas oil man or aviation, however he made his wealth. They found him intriguing, right? And I would argue he could have, if he weren't crazy, he could have won that campaign. He could have won it, right? And we don't need to go into the details of the story of his dropping out. It's just bizarre. It's like kind of paranoia. Thank goodness he didn't make it into the Oval Office. His daughter was getting married. He was paranoid. He'd heard reports that the Republicans were going to sabotage his daughter's wedding or something. And he drops out. Yeah. And then later on, he gets back in and he still gets 20%, even after that, like proving himself to be like certifiable, right? So that's right. He was significant. And I would also argue he played a significant role in what the Democrats and the Republicans became in terms of their agenda, their focus in subsequent elections, and that his candidacy really was influential. Okay. And then since then we've had, right, we talked about, so Perot did create the Reform Party, right? And he ran under the label of the Reform Party. He gets 8% in 96. So the major parties by then have kind of stolen his thunder, right? He's sort of diminishing in his appeal. The party label kind of hangs around. It even is around today, but nobody really pays any attention to it. But there is one figure who adopted the reform label who was successful. From my home state, in 1998, Jesse the Body Ventura. Jesse the Body Ventura, right? Professional wrestler, bit cameo actor, usually as a side man to Arnold Schwarzenegger in those kinds of movies. Goes on to like be a radio talk shock jock, whatever, right? And is the mayor of a small, insignificant northwestern suburb of Minneapolis. And he runs for the governorship in Minnesota. And he beat not two hacks, he beat two pretty solid, Norm Coleman on the Republican side, who would go on to be a U.S. Senator, and Skip Humphrey, the son of the great Hubert H. Humphrey. Like that name carried a lot of weight, and that's who he beat, right? In Minnesota. And so as we think about what might a third party, this one too, I want you to kind of file it away. What would a third party candidacy or candidate need to be successful? So again, in the note card, somebody was chastising me for mentioning Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and whoever mentioned Tom Hanks and say, really, we're resorting to celebrity candidates. And I was only half joking, maybe a little tongue in cheek, but only slightly there. Because Ventura, I remember to this day watching the debate on Minnesota public television, along with the other 6 people who watch public television in Minnesota. But here you had 3 candidates and they arranged it just so. And Norm Coleman, kind of slight, diminutive, Skip Humphrey, pasty-faced, and they were on each side. And in the middle, you had Jesse the Body Ventura. Just the image, larger than life. And you had these 2 stereotypical Democratic and Republican candidates, and you had gravelly voiced, bald, right? Talking Trump, right? Talking Trumpism, talking that kind of sort of blunt, straightforward kind of mode of appealing to connecting with voters. And lo and behold, he gets elected. This isn't really a topic for this class. His governorship turns out to be a disaster. I mean, he can't work with the Democrats or the Republicans. He is immediately sort of shunted to irrelevancy. And lo and behold, we get a Democratic and Republican Party in the Minnesota state legislature who actually worked well together. It's sort of a kind of an era of like good state governance. So maybe that's the lesson. I don't know. Okay, other kind of modern third-party challenges that it's worth mentioning. We've talked about Ralph Nader, 2000, right? The election of Bush v. Gore, Nader running under the Green Party label. He gets 2 million votes nationwide. He gets just under 100,000 votes in Florida, right? Bush wins Florida and the Electoral College by 537 votes. It is undeniable that, right, that Nader cost Gore the election. Okay, in 2000. And then we get to write our alternative history for the novelists in the room. 2016, right, we get the Green Party in kind of this millennium. They start off as a single issue party, really running on environmental issues, but now they sort of have branched out into a number of progressive causes. They start out, so we tend to think of them at the presidential level. Jill Stein, right, got, I think in 2016, when it was Trump Clinton, she got right around 1% of the vote, not insignificant in that context. But the Green Party, again, a party that had some success at the state and local level, particularly on the West Coast and the more liberal states of California and up and down the coast, a number of Green Party candidates who won seats in the state legislature. So they've had some influence in that regard. The Libertarian Party, somebody asked me about, am I going to mention the Libertarian Party, right? They are our first third party in modern American politics, right? They actually have more of a sort of structural, a structure and a hierarchy and like political campaign norms. The Libertarians follow those and they put up candidates every year. And in 2016, Gary Johnson, the Libertarian candidate, wins 3.5% of the vote nationwide. Again, suggesting a level of discontent with Clinton and Trump and with that matchup. So keep this in mind, right? So when we sort of talk about some possible strategies, right? Johnson gets like 3.4% in 2016. Okay. The Libertarian candidate, Joe Jorgensen, in 2020 gets like just over 1%. Okay. So in 2016, Gary Johnson gets 4.5 million votes. In 2020, Joe Jorgensen gets 1.8 million, something like that. If we would have had Johnson, or if Jorgensen would have been able to replicate Johnson's performance in 2020, I would argue we might well have had a different result. So again, as we're thinking about the influence and the possible strategies of third parties, that's significant. And we can talk more about that. I can kind of share my kind of empirical breakdown of that vote. Let me take a breath and sip on my tea and just see if there are a couple questions that we have on kind of the third party history. Please wait for the mic if you have a question. Yeah.
We have one comment online.
Okay.
Rob asked if you read David Brooks' column in the New York Times published on Saturday discussing religion and politics, and what is your opinion if you have?
Yes, I did. I did read Brooks's column. What do I make of it on religion and politics? Yeah, I mean, David Brooks is always thoughtful. David Brooks is also completely a product of the establishment. So as much as I've met him, I like him. He's a serious thinker. He also is very much a reflection of one swath in our political ecosystem. And it is a swath that bears no small responsibility for giving us our current situation, right? And the anti-establishment tenor of our politics really since 2016. So I don't mean to be mean, because I really do like, and he writes a lot of good stuff. But he just can't, he's writing for the New York Times, right? He just can't really shed his sort of deep establishmentarian kind of mindset. Religion and politics, that's not our topic here today. Okay. Believe me, that's my topic, right? I write a lot about religion and politics, faith and politics. That's kind of where I do a lot of my research. You get me going and we'll be here till this afternoon. So I'd love to come back, and please invite me to come back and do something on kind of religion and politics, because he made some good points. You know, what we viewed in the wake of Charlie Kirk's death and the memorial service, these are really significant. Really interesting, really important. In some way, right, as a person of faith, I find some encouraging signs. As someone who is an evangelical and has watched evangelicalism really get enmeshed and intertwined with conservative politics and Republican politics to an unhealthy degree, I'm really sensitive to the hijacking of faith for political purposes. I will confess, I kind of watched a few little clips of the memorial service. I read about it. I can't really talk from firsthand experience. It really merits our thinking carefully about it. Okay. And so on the one hand, like on one side, right, Charlie Kirk was a conservative. He was an incredible organizer, far more influential. I wouldn't really follow him that closely, kind of knew who he was. What has happened in the wake of his death has revealed to me, like among college students, just right. And among college students who especially felt their college campuses were hostile space for them, that he had a reach and a connection. I had no idea, right? His cup of tea ain't my cup of tea in terms of kind of how we engage people, but he was doing it. And he was trying to do it. And by the last years in his life, it sounds like he was really trying to be a faithful person. And I give him credit for that, right? That's important. And I'm of the mind, faith is not something we compartmentalize and we just put off on the shelf and we limit it to the private. That's a misreading of the Establishment Clause. We would ask that of no other group of voters motivated by other views, value frames, and et cetera. Having said that, the triumphalism, right, that oftentimes that I would pick up here, right, the way it was done, it could not help but have a significant sort of political rally piece to it. And that's unfortunate. So much more. You can tell I'm like very conflicted over it. Yeah, it is potentially really dangerous for us to sort of meld, kind of faith, religion, party politics, nationalism and patriotism. That's a potentially toxic brew. And we really need to be very careful. We need to speak out about it and watch it. We need to speak with great care and precision about what it is we're looking at. So I just did a lecture a couple of weeks ago on Christian nationalism. And that term has ceased to have any use because it means different things to different people. It's bandied about to describe all sorts of things. In many circles, it's really trying to get at this unhealthy merging of patriotism and nation with Christianity, right? That is deeply problematic. But then it's also used in other ways, I would argue, to marginalize and to really kind of privatize people who might be motivated by their faith, to bring their faith into sort of the public square. So all that to say, you can tell I have, lots of different thoughts. It's really complicated, really important. It really is sort of beyond the reach of this class. So please invite me back. I'd love to talk about that. Yeah. One more question, and then we want to talk about some strategies. Yes.
One word I haven't mentioned this whole morning is money. Wherever the vote goes is where the money's at. The money controls what the parties are presenting because they want the money to get elected. And in order to get elected, you have to have the money. These days, the money picks the candidates, the money picks the platform, the money picks what legislation is put forward. The money is super overpowerful, and it's dominating our entire political landscape.
Okay. I think I said last week I'm skeptical of that line, right? I think that's the dominant narrative. Certainly many politicians are acting as if that is the case, i.e. they devote all, right, to be a congressman or woman or senator in today's US Congress. The time they spend at fundraisers, making the calls, it's obscene, it's egregious. They hate it. They view that as critical to their success. I suggested last week, I don't think that's necessarily the case anymore. So I think that's the perception, and I'm not beating up on you. Your perception, that many people in the room would probably share that. I think in this day and age with social media, other means of connecting technology, I just don't think it's the case. I don't think it's the case. I think we have so many young people and they are techno wizards and social media wizards. And if we could get them to actually commit to, how might we use our expertise to do political activism rather than doing TikTok reels and in all the stuff that they do, right? I think we could really have significant political reform. Mights and maybes, but that, like I said, Donald Trump won the presidency twice, spending far less money than his opponent. Okay, money right. Believe me, I teach parties and elections over at Hope, and as a part of our class, we look at spending. I have the students do they do case studies. Okay, on Senate and House races, we kind of focus at the federal level. They always have to work the campaign finance piece into their analysis, right? And what we have seen, the data, it doesn't completely undermine your position, but it really should give us pause, okay? And so, right, as the Democratic Party really has become more the party of the well-heeled, and the Republican Party more working class, like in recent election cycles, Democrats have badly outspent Republicans on average in House and Senate races. And in some of these, not even close, right? So some key Senate races, some last time, the Democrat raising about and spending about 60 million, the Republican who ended up winning, spending about 11 million. Okay, that ain't chump change. It's still a lot of money, but it should reinforce, right, our acknowledgement that money is not everything. And there are so many other ways now of communicating, of reaching voters, of organizing. Jesse Ventura in this way was something of a trailblazer, in that he got elected. And guess who is? Surprise, surprise. He got elected on the heels of bringing in one demographic of voter who had not voted before. Young men, 18 to 34, people who watch Schwarzenegger movies, who watch professional wrestling, right? And here to your, right, this does give some credit to what you're saying. There was a Minnesota campaign finance law, public financing law, that gave him some money. It gave him some money to run a campaign. But hold on a sec, what he did was to be online, and he was recruiting volunteers like one step ahead of the next rally. It was really remarkable. And this is in the early days of technology, but he used technology and some public funding to have a legitimate campaign. And those kinds of rallies, they gained momentum, they had spark to them. It was arguably less the money then allowed him to run some ads, but it was the organizing, the technology that allowed him to get volunteers and people and human resources. So yes and no. Yes and no. We need to move on. We've got about 20 minutes. I want to make sure others.
Just that the PACs control billions of dollars,
Sure,
not labeled by any politician, not labeled, but they're in the background. They have their own agenda.
Sure.
They're forcing their agenda.
Yep.
They are controlling things.
Sure. They have a lot of impact. That's more in the lobbying sense than the spending for campaign sense. I'm going to push back on you on that. Certainly there's a problem with kind of shadow organizations and dark money, and there's a lack of transparency. Absolutely. So I don't mean to gainsay what you're saying. I just don't think it's definitive. And it is not dispositive, and it is not an insurmountable obstacle for people who are motivated to be creative and to use all the other things at their disposal in this incredibly technology-driven world to organize. All right, so it's about 22. We've got about 20 or 25 minutes left. So I was going to, let's see, sort of categorizing third parties. Let's jump ahead in my outline, kind of fixing the party system and thinking about possible third-party strategies. And so here, right, when I laid my cards on the table at the start of last week, I suggested there's this fatalism, this sense that people have, we don't like the two major parties, we don't think they work well, we want third parties, but we feel like there's nothing we can do about it, okay? And so, and I suggested, I think, again, back to this idea of creativity, innovation, energy, a willingness to try some different things and to think strategically. Okay, and strategically, with the end in mind, again, for me, is moving the major parties, making the major parties reform themselves and do better, and to make them more responsive and more representative. Okay, that's my goal. I'm not quite ready to just punt on the two-party system. I would prefer, as I said, I think it's worked fairly well for much of our history. Can we do things where third parties, we can energize them, or they can be more energized, with the goal of making the major parties do their task of representation better? Okay, so thinking about some possible strategies, here are a few, and then we'll kind of open it up. And so one possible strategy is to play the role of the spoiler. Okay. And so that was Ralph Nader in 2000, right? He was the spoiler. He spoiled it for Al Gore and the Democrats. His presence in Florida was decisive. Okay. That I would suggest was maybe Gary Johnson in 2016, maybe the Libertarian in 2020. They were close to being spoilers. Okay. Now, if I want that strategy to impact the major parties, it can't just be after the fact. Oh, look at the votes, he was a spoiler. It has to be someone who has enough cachet, enough profile, enough ability ahead of the election to say, I'm a spoiler. And guess what? Like, I'm going to spoil your major party, your campaign, your election, your desire to win, unless you do this, right? So it would require a certain kind of candidate with a certain kind of profile, with a certain kind of bully pulpit, and the threat of being a spoiler such that the major party candidates have to pay attention. Okay, so Ross Perot was a potential spoiler who the major parties didn't really pay attention to him in 1992. But guess what? They paid attention afterwards, right? So I tend to think, this is a little simplistic, I tend to think of Ross Perot as largely a one-note pony. One-note song, that's mixing my metaphors, right? And it was fiscal responsibility, right? More than anything, he was motivated by a growing debt, and he wanted fiscal responsibility, right? And you had the Democrats and the Republicans. This is laughable now, given the profligacy across the board, right? But in 1992, the Republicans and the Democrats didn't seem serious. There was not really, it was not an issue that had salience among the major party candidates in 1992. He gets 20%. 1994, Newt Gingrich, contract with America. What's one of the items in the contract of America? Balanced budget amendment. Balanced budget amendment, right? That was in response to Ross Perot's 1992 candidacy. And what was at the heart of it? 1996, Bill Clinton gets reelected as a new Democrat who's actually talking about fiscal responsibility, right? In response to Perot in 1992. So so the dynamic, the sort of the what's in the air, right? The context, can someone play that spoiler role in a way that elevates their threat, what they stand for, that is going to force the two major parties to respond? Okay, one potential strategy. A second one, a related one, I would say, is to seek to deny either the major party candidates an electoral college victory. Okay, to aim to deny either the Democrat or the Republican a win in the electoral college. What happens if you don't, right? If nobody gets to 271 in the electoral college? Goes to the House, right? Goes to the House. What would happen in a House that is 219, 213? Anybody's guess, right? And guess what? All of a sudden, who has negotiating power, who has leverage, right? That person who denied the Democrat or Republican the win. All right. And next thing you know, it's like, okay, I will let my electoral college votes go if you A, B, C, D, and E. And next thing you know, the major party candidates are having to respond. Now, my preference would be, I'm kind of assuming that's someone who has a nice, attractive sort of agenda to centrists and moderates and independents in the middle. Okay. Right, that's Wallace in 68. It's Thurman in 48 being close to doing that, getting in, right? 39 electoral college votes in one instance, 48 or 46 in the other, right? So it would require a certain kind of candidate, one who has sort of regional appeal or appeal in certain states, and can win some states. Is that outlandish? I don't think so, right? I don't think so, given how close the Electoral College was, especially in 2016 and 2020. Okay, let me give you an example and kind of jot the, so this was Biden and Trump in 2020. Okay, so Biden, right, he wins the Electoral College. This is not a very good one. Let's see if this one is better. With 300, and that's not really any better, is it? Trump, let's see, Trump gets 232. So that's the Electoral College win. Okay. Remember, I gave you some numbers at the very outset, and I gave you sort of the difference in 3 states that gave Biden the Electoral College victory, and the number of third-party libertarian votes in those states, right? So here's Arizona. See if this is better. Is that better? Kind of. All right. So Arizona, Biden wins by, sorry, can people, there's no way I'm going to get everybody. I'll talk it through, okay? Biden wins by 12,000 votes, okay, in Arizona. The Libertarian candidate, that's JJ, okay, that's Joe Jorgensen, 62,000 votes. Remember what I said last time about a significant majority of votes to libertarians coming from Republicans. Okay, more right-leaning libertarians. The Green Party candidate, I don't even remember, Hawkins, I think it was, right? And these are going to be more likely votes taken from the Democrat, 1,000. Okay, 12,000. I mean, even if it's 65-35, I think, like I'm making some assumptions here, it's not unreasonable to say Jorgensen cost Trump Arizona. Okay, I think that's a pretty good argument. We're talking 11 electoral college votes. Okay, then on to Georgia. Biden wins Georgia by 12,000 votes. Okay. Oh, you know what? I got this wrong. So this was actually, I'm not sure this changes things, but 51,000 votes. Here in Georgia, Jorgensen gets 62,000 votes. And here the Green Party candidate gets like 1.5 thousand. Is it unreasonable to say one could make a pretty good case? One would really need to dissect these. I think one could make a pretty good case that Jorgensen cost Trump Georgia's 16 electoral college votes. This is the Electoral College. Yep. So this isn't, right, it's only Nebraska and Maine where you have some, it gets a little complicated. This is winner take all, okay? Then we get down to Wisconsin. Biden wins Wisconsin by 20,000 votes. The Libertarian Joe Jorgensen gets 38,000 votes. I don't think that's quite enough. Right? I don't think that's quite enough. So under my calculation, let's see, 10 electoral college votes, but I don't think Jorgensen was the spoiler here. Okay. I do think one can make a good case that Jorgensen and the Libertarians were the spoilers here. And so let's subtract 27, and it's like 9. I can't do the basic math. 279. Okay. Plus 27. It's 9, 5, 2. So Biden still wins, only it's like 20 electoral college votes. 20 electoral college votes. Okay. Now let's say, rather than running the lame libertarian campaign that they normally do, you had someone, they recruited a kind of candidate and engaged in the kind of mindset ahead of time that we are the spoiler. We are focusing on a handful. These are the states we're focusing on. And our whole idea is to prevent them from an electoral college win, not visit. And let's say Jorgensen, instead of 38,000, gets 100,000. That's not that outlandish. Okay, so with a few more votes here, Jorgensen denies Trump 10 electoral college votes. What? Take away 10, we have 269. Add 10, we have 269. Oh, baby, bring it on. That would be fun, wouldn't it? No, now you go to the Electoral College. Or not you go to the House of Representatives, right? And you've got a tie. And you're the third party spoiler. Is this just crafty sort of manipulation of the numbers by Ryden? Or with people who are mindful of being a spoiler, might they actually make the major parties sit up, pay attention, respond to the kinds of issues that they're giving some voice to? I would have loved to have seen that. I mean, I would love to. That would have been so much fun. Okay, so that's a second strategy, right? Focus on the Electoral College. You focus all your resources. Don't do a 50-state ballot access movement because you're going to waste all your resources. You pick 5 swing states and you put all your resources into those swing states. Okay, and it's about winning some Electoral College votes. That's number 2. Number 3, strategy number 3, you focus on a handful of congressional or Senate seats. And it's not about winning the presidency. It's about trying to deny majority control in Congress. Okay, and so it was, again, one of your comments, some said, well, how about like a third party gets 5 Senate seats and 20 House seats? Exactly. And in this era of parity, it's not only forcing campaigns to be more responsive to a broader set of issues, they're going to have to govern in a more responsive way, right? And so in a 219, 213 House balance of power, if again, a concerted third-party movement focuses on 20 districts, and your goal is to win 5 or 7 or 8. And that completely changes the dynamic of what happens in Congress. And I would say that is not all that outrageous. Okay. Fourthly and finally, we do that, only we do it at a state level. Okay. And so here we have what I would call the Michigan project or the Minnesota project. Okay. I'll take the Minnesota project first, where we have the House. And so the idea is to give a third party to have them start doing something at the state level, building that infrastructure, making the parties sit up, pay attention that, oh, we need to respond to these challenges. Okay. In Minnesota, the House of the state legislature is controlled by the Republicans 67 to 66. Wait, it gets better. The Senate is controlled by the Democrats, 33 to 32. 1 seat majority for the Republicans in the House, in the state House, 1 seat Democratic control in the state Senate. And we have an upcoming gubernatorial election with Tim Walz running for a 3rd term. Tim Walz, I would argue, was not well served by his vice presidential candidacy. I don't think he's a strong candidate. He is going against Scott Jensen, who's sort of the resurrection of Harold Stassen, who I mentioned, right? Tired Republican. The surveys actually have them about five percentage points apart, and like a good significant number of undecideds. I would argue that's a state that is ripe for a concerted third-party effort to focus on a handful of legislative seats and the governorship. And they come together, they organize, they campaign together. Like, that's what I'm talking about, right? That's the Minnesota project. The Michigan project, I think, is pretty compelling. Where you have the House, the Republicans have a margin of, a majority margin, 58 to 52. The Senate, the Democrats' margin, 19 to 18. Okay, 1 seat. And we have a gubernatorial contest with Jocelyn Benson and John James, the front runners. They are polling at 35-34. And the independent candidate, Michael Dugan, who's right now at 22%. Okay, former Democrat, former mayor of Detroit. And so here's where I'm going to tell you to put your money where your mouth is, people. I don't care if you're a Republican or you need to sacrifice your party allegiances and you need to vote for Michael Dugan. Because here's someone, he's an old-time Democrat. He cut his teeth, representing unions, labor, working class. He served the city of Detroit for 12 years, 8 years. And he's been, he won the label of best mayor in the country. And he's done things in a city that was ungovernable, that was hollowed out. Right? They've rebuilt downtown. They've gotten rid of their vacant lots, police, emergency vehicles actually respond in like minutes rather than hours. It's a miracle. It is a small scale miracle. And if there's anyone who deserves, as a third party candidate, broad scale support, it's Dugan. I'm serious. But in terms of that waste your vote, guess what? Democrats, you got to say, okay, I'm not going to vote for Benson. I'm going to vote for Dugan. Republicans, you got to say, John James, he's not going to win anyway. You got to vote for Dugan. This is how it starts. I'm serious. Next time I come back, post-election, I'm going to call you on the carpet. All right, we have a few minutes maybe for questions or comments.
I don't see the motivation, looking at the example on the board here, because if JJ over there would flip the election to, since he was probably more sympathetic to the Republican Party, people voting for him are voting for the opposite party in essence. So maybe they're disgruntled with their party, but it seems counter productive for them to do that because they're throwing the election to their opponents.
If they're playing the spoiler role, right? So you're right. There may be a question, and just because the lesser of two evils, I can vote for my third party candidate, but am I essentially giving a vote to the main party candidate on the other side, and they're worse, and so I'll swallow my desire and I'll kind of eat it. In sort of trying to deprive them of 271 electoral college votes, then I think the calculus changes. Then I think the calculus really changes, because then it's about negotiation, it's about leverage, it's about getting concessions from the major parties on issues that that matter to you. Motivation is a huge thing in all of this, right? And for so many of us, you all were happy to say, I love the idea of a third party, but now I'm suggesting you can't cast your major party vote. And now you're like throwing daggers my way. So, a couple other quick questions, quick comments.
Maybe more as a reflection of where we are with the two parties as opposed to a strategy, but it could become a strategy. Which of the parties or candidates moving to the next national election might be more susceptible to success of a third party candidate?
Who might be more kind of responsive
Or vulnerable to a third party candidate, given where those two platforms are, assuming Trump doesn't run for a third term.
Yeah, thanks for throwing that in. I suppose it depends on like who sort of rises to the top. On the Republican side, odds are it's Vance or Rubio. I think Vance is sort of, what's that? Yeah, no, I mean, I think these are the two legitimate candidates. I think people take Vance unseriously at their peril. He is really smart. He's crafty. He's ambitious, right? Troublingly so oftentimes. He's also someone who I'm guessing would trim his sails in terms of kind of the hard-edged piece if he were a general party candidate. Marco Rubio, I actually think is gifted at speaking to broader audiences. He really is more of an honest kind of populist, I think. On the Democratic side, right, is it Newsom? Who else? I mean, a Gretchen Whitmer. Shapiro's he's just not gonna go anywhere, I don't think. The kind of the antipathy towards Israel in the Democratic Party is so deep. I don't know. I think you would need to see who's there. I mean, I think Democrats are a little more stuck actually in trying to find someone who can navigate the different wings and not just be kind of right and acting on the left side, the left wing of the party. So I don't know. Yes, I can repeat her question if you want me to. Yeah, okay, or not.
What do you think of the possibility of Andy Bashir at some point being viable as a candidate? A red state governor.
Yep,
who's
exactly.
a Democrat.
Yeah, that's what we need. Andy Bashir, Kentucky. He's like a sensible Democrat, right? He sort of reflects the state from which he comes. This is, I have said all along, and I can increasingly, right, we keep putting up senators, and they have been conditioned by service in the Senate, and that doesn't help anyone, right? And so governors, right, by definition, they have to be pragmatic. They have to learn to lead a state that has diverse interests, and especially if it's, yeah, someone who's a little more right, who's leading like a kind of slightly left-leaning state, or a Bashir who's right, kind of the converse. And someone, so you mentioned Ross Shapiro. I really like Ross Shapiro. I thought he has the ability to speak in a way that resonates across party lines. I think his identity and it's a reflection of the Democratic Party that kind of makes him impalatable. I would say, yeah, governors who they've shown they can build a broader coalition. That's where I would like to see our candidates come from. We're out of time, I think. Are we?
We have. Thank you very much, Dr. Ryden,
Sure.
and thank you all.